Hello and welcome to my channel NB Soundtopper UK, and the subject of this video will be 10 Warp Records albums from the 1990s. In 1988, the second summer of love brought electronic dance music such as acid house into the wider public consciousness. As the 80s drew to a close, it became increasingly evident that there were a number of people who, although inspired by acid house, wanted to expand beyond its sonic limitations. Several independent labels emerged, showcasing the type of material that these people were interested in recording, of which Sheffield-based Warp Records were one. What Warp Records were clearly able to demonstrate was that, in terms of popular music, rock was no longer at the forefront of creative innovation. The baton had been passed to electronic music, and throughout the 90s, the roster of performers releasing material on Warp Records moved in a forwards direction. After the 90s, Warp Records broadened its range, and the pace of progress slowed as a consequence. So Warp Records' output in the 90s, to me, represents a fast-moving, exciting period for progressive music. I've not ranked the albums I'm highlighting because, to my ears, they all sound great, and even if I were to rank them now, tomorrow I might well put them in a different order. Instead, I'll present them in performer alpha order. Here goes then. First up is I Care Because You Do by Aphex Twin from 1995. Aphex Twin is one of the many aliases Richard D. James has recorded under, but it is the one he is probably best known for. I Care Because You Do was his second album for Warp Records, Selected Ambient Works, Volume 2 being the first, and the Richard D. James album being the third. Of the three, I find I Care Because You Do the most satisfying listen. Partly that's because it doesn't have the CD bloat of Selected Ambient Works Volume 2, nor the brevity and sense of incompleteness of the Richard D. James album. I Care Because You Do combines melodic ambient textures, orchestral sounds, and abrasive industrial rhythms. In some respects, a precursor of the subgenre of electronica known as breakcore, which came to the fore at the end of the decade and for 2 or 3 years into the 2000s. One of the strengths of this album is that it has these contrasts, but they don't come across as too jarring. Hence, there is a decent flow across the album's 63 minutes, and tracks like Icot, which is centered on an orchestral sound, and Ventolin with its metallic beat and incessant electronic squeal don't end up sounding like they belong on different albums. Second is Chiastic Slide by Autechre from 1996. Of all the artists who've recorded for Warp Records, Autechre are perhaps the most fascinating. Starting out with their 1993 debut album Incunabula, they've transformed from a fairly straightforward electronica sound to a mutated, complex, experimental electronic one where it can be quite difficult to work out what's going on, but which is extremely rewarding when you finally get there. For a number of years, I had a one-album lag on getting my head around what they were doing. In other words, whenever they released a new album, it wasn't until then that the previous one started to make a bit more sense. Anyway, Chiastic Slide is Autechre right on the cusp of detaching themselves from conventional notions of how music should be structured. This was their fourth album on Warp. Several of the tracks balance between what Autechre were and what they would become, thus providing added interest. Tracks like Recurie, Nuan, Retic-Ac and Hub are all examples. For my money, Autechre have been one of the most remarkable acts to come out of the UK in the last 70 years. Not everyone's cup of tea though, as there's little in the way of instant gratification. Perseverance and patience required. Third is Music for Adverts and Short Films by The Black Dog from 1996. Including the album Bites, released by Black Dog Productions, Music for Adverts and Short Films was the third and final album released by the Black Dog on Warp Records. By the time the album was recorded, the Black Dog was actually Ken Downey on his own, with former members Ed Handley and Andy Turner continuing recording under the name of Plaid. This album has Downey placing focus on North African and Middle Eastern rhythms in many of the tracks, which is far from a run-of-the-mill approach. In keeping with the album's title, the tracks are mostly short but are blended into one another to good effect, thus making the album sound like a continuous piece. Sampled film extracts are also used, including one from the 1961 film The Pit and the Pendulum. Critically, I don't think this album is that highly regarded, but as I'm a sucker for the type of rhythms used on the album, for me it's a winner. Fourth is Music Has the Right to Children by Boards of Canada from 1998. This was their full-length debut. One of its characteristics, the prevalence of vintage analog synths, is notable and sets it apart from the approach used by many of their contemporaries. Field recordings, found sounds, hip-hop rhythms and samples weren't that uncommon in electronic music, but the degraded production methods evoke a sense of vague familiarity and nostalgia, yet at the same time something rather alien. Of course, degraded production wasn't exactly new either. In trip-hop, for example, the sound of vinyl records clicking and popping was frequently used, but with Boards of Canada, it's more a case of sounding like a worn-out cassette tape. It makes for a wonky and warped sound, one which has inspired many to try and emulate it. A track such as Roy G. Biv has a touch of genius about it, where it starts off sounding rather ominous, but is then transformed into something almost blissful by doing nothing more than a bit of melodic layering. I don't think it's an exaggeration to describe this album as a landmark of its genre. Fifth is Advance by LFO from 1996. Low Frequency Oscillation, or LFO, released their debut album Frequencies on Warp in 1991. Whilst it was groundbreaking and is indeed a fine album, the follow-up Advance, released 5 years later, definitely lives up to its name. There are 12 tracks that cover a range of electronic flavours, all of which are superbly performed. It's one of those albums where, when you get to the end of it, it seems as though you're only just listening to the first track. What helps make it all work is the fact that none of the tracks seem too short or too long, 5 minutes 30 being the longest and 3 minutes 51 the shortest. For anyone unfamiliar with the sort of electronic music released by Warp Records in the 1990s, I'd say that LFO were closest to the mainstream and the most accessible, as there isn't the kind of complexity that you'd find with most of the other artists I'm featuring here. Sixth is Rest-Proof Clockwork by Plaid from 1999. Perhaps more so than any of the albums and artists in this list, Plaid's great strength is in their use of melody, harmony and counter-melody, complemented by the subtle use of reverb to provide depth. By and large, Rest-Proof Clockwork is therefore a good representation of what Plaid are all about. It's loaded with catchy and uplifting tracks, even the short ones which act as interludes, for example, Tear Risky, Through Recurring, Churn Maiden and Lamb's Eye aren't short on melody. Many of the longer tracks, such as New Bass Hippo, Pinot Pomo, Shakboo, Gel Lab and Dang Spot are just the sort to put me in a good mood. The rhythms rarely overpower the melody, nevertheless they are an important component. Although not as exotic as those used when the members of Plaid were in the Black Dog, the rhythmic styles are interesting and varied. You won't hear a standard 4/4 thud. Terrific album. Seventh is Haunted Dancehall by the Sabres of Paradise from 1994. As well as being a much respected producer, the late Andrew Weatherall was also a key player in this group, the Sabres of Paradise, and a few years later, Two Lone Swordsmen. Haunted Dancehall is a very diverse album stylistically. Unsurprisingly, its main focal point is electronica, but also thrown into the mix are reasonable-sized slabs of dub, some Latin American-sounding brass on the track Wilmot, and a brick gangster film type guitar melody on the track Tow Truck. If the loose concept behind this album is to observe the ghosts in a once popular but now abandoned and dilapidated South London venue, then the mixture of styles works really well. When it comes to my favourite tracks, Bubble and Slide and Ballad of Nicky Maguire come out on top, although there are plenty of others which run them close. I wouldn't say Haunted Dancehall is the most challenging of listens. However, sometimes that's precisely what the doctor ordered. Eighth is Sucker by Seafeel from 1995. Seafeel's second album and their first on Warp. Where their debut album Kike highlighted the meeting of electronic music and shoegaze or dreamy pop, Sucker is a much darker and sombre affair to the extent that this feels like their debut's dark twin. Kike had tracks which you could listen to and lie back and relax. Sucker has ones which seem far more anxious and fidgety. It's ironic that one of the tracks on Sucker is called Vex because maybe that's how the band felt at the time, vexed by trying to establish a musical direction in which to go. And there is a sense of uncertainty that's running throughout the album. Despite that, the contrast to their debut makes sure it's an intriguing follow-up. Ninth is G-Spot by Speedy J from 1995. Jochen Pap is from Rotterdam and releases music under the name of Speedy J, presumably a reference to his turntable skills rather than drugs. He released 2 albums on Warp Records in the 1990s. The first, Ginger, was part of Warp's Artificial Intelligence series of albums, but for me, the second album, G-Spot, is a little more ambitious in terms of layering and arrangements and smooths out some of Ginger's rougher edges. The latter possibly owes a bit to technological advances between the 2 albums being recorded. The tracks range from ambient to electro and techno, and the track placement gives the album a nice undulation, making it a pleasing listen overall, with several highlights. When it comes to layering, the Oil Zone is about as fine an example as you're likely to hear. As with Plaid's Rest-Proof Clockwork, another feel-good album. 10th is Selection 16 by Squarepusher from 1999. Tom Jenkinson, a multi-instrumentalist from Essex, is Squarepusher, and Selection 16 was his 4th album and his 3rd on Warp Records. Jazz is a major influence on Squarepusher, and the degree of virtuosity he demonstrates, particularly on bass guitar, gives him a niche all of his own when compared to others on the label. His previous album, Music is Rotted One Note, is maybe his most jazz fusion-focused album. This is in contrast to Selection 16, which is his most conventional in terms of electronic music and musical structure in a general sense. Drum and bass get a look in, as does acid techno, whereas jazz-style tracks are limited to shorter pieces. Penultimate track, Schism No. 2 Mix, remains one of my favourite Squarepusher tracks, which combines the aforementioned drum and bass and acid techno with a touch of dark ambience thrown in for good measure. Despite being a long way from Squarepusher's most adventurous album, it's one I'd recommend as an ideal place to start exploring his discography. And that's it, a sample of what Warp Records was releasing in the 1990s. For people around in the 60s and 70s and 80s who are fans of stuff like Tangerine Dream or Vangelis or Jean-Michel Jarre, a lot of the artists I've mentioned are arguably a logical progression. So if you've never heard anything by, say, Plaid, then give them a go. Other notable labels featuring electronic music during this decade were Fax and Emit, possibly the subjects of future videos. I'll close with my usual polite request for feedback as per the graphics shown top left, and if you've made it this far, thanks for watching.